All right, so just to review, there are four basic subregions of colonial settlement. Name for me the northernmost colonial subregion. New England, very good. And sort of the exemplar state that comes in New England? What's the state we always think of? Yeah, Massachusetts. Good job. Okay, and then next, just a bit south of New England, we have not yet, the middle colonies, right? And then after, that was in order, and then after the middle colonies, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a second, what comes next? The Chesapeake Bay. What two states border the Chesapeake Bay? Virginia and Maryland, very good. And finally, we have those southern colonies there, the Carolinas and Georgia. So we talked a little bit yesterday about the middle colonies, but I want to remind you about them again. So first of all, what the middle colonies have in common is that they are not New England or the Chesapeake. They really have very diverse characteristics, but generally we can say that in New England, agriculture is a bigger economic focus than it was in New England, but it is not the same sort of like all-encompassing focus of the economy like we would see in Virginia, right? So in the Chesapeake, agriculture is everything. Their entire economy is based on this plantation system. In the middle colonies, agriculture is important. Eventually, they'll become the breadbasket of the colonies, right? They're going to produce wheat and oats and other food products, unlike in New England, where very little agriculture is done, at least on a big scale. On the other hand, trade and commerce does make up a fair amount of the economy of the middle colonies, right? So especially at the Port of New York, as well as in New Jersey, we see quite a bit of commercial activity. They are bringing in shipments, they're offloading raw materials, those kinds of things, which in some ways ties them to New England. Besides that, there's a lot of diversity here, right? So New York is actually a colony that we sort of kind of stole from the Dutch. And by sort of kind of, I mean we really did. The English came and basically forced the Dutch out, the Dutch who had occupied the New Netherlands colony. Pennsylvania, as we discussed yesterday, was purchased by William Penn from, who did he purchase it from? The Native Americans, right? I mean, it was only sort of kind of a fair deal, but it was a fairer deal than any of the other colonies that we saw founded, where basically the Native Americans got nothing and or were killed, usually aimed. And then, of course, we've got Jersey. And Jersey was one of the first proprietary colonies, right? So do you remember what that word proprietary meant? Independent, somebody owns it, right? So to own. So the proprietary colonies were grants of land given by the king to particular individuals. And so Jersey was one of those proprietary colonies to begin with. So of course we talked about the Quakers in Pennsylvania. So we're going to kind of shift our focus now to look at the southern colonies. These will be the Carolinas and Georgia. We'll start with the Carolinas. So interestingly, the Carolinas were also proprietary colonies. Remind me one more time, what does it mean to be a proprietary colony? How did that colony get founded? The king, well, the king didn't buy it. The king gifted it. He gave it to an individual, right? And to give you a comparison, Virginia was not a proprietary colony, right? There was no one individual, like one noble who was granted all this land. Virginia started out, the charter was given to the Virginia Company, right? Do you guys remember that part? And so it was like a group of individuals that kind of came to give you another comparison. Like the Massachusetts Bay Colony was not a proprietary colony. The king gave a charter to the Puritans who wanted to come here. But that charter wasn't like to an individual person. It was like, you have my permission to go and found a settlement. But a proprietary colony begins as a gift of land, right? Like technically, North America has been, claimed, or south of Newfoundland and north of Florida has been claimed for the English, right? All these, explorers who have come. And so the king feels like he owns this territory. And he says, all right, I'm going to give this group, this piece of land to you as a reward for your excellent service. Sort of a funny side story. Normally, those rewards were actually like, you think you deserve something, and I think you're a poop face. So I'm going to give you this semi-worthless land in North America, and good luck, buddy, right? That's kind of how it all went down. But anyway, so those are proprietary colonies. They were given to an individual person. And the thing was that the Carolinas had a really hard time attracting settlers, and they're never going to be profitable. This is never going to be a good gift if they can't get settlers to come and work the land and eke out a profit and all that thing. Well, why doesn't anybody want to come? I mean, if you had to pick between New England and the Chesapeake, where are you going to pick? Chesapeake. You guys want to go to Jamestown where they all eat people and rats and their belts? And no, I don't think so. I mean, they're all fairly difficult rides, especially compared. I mean, like no air conditioning. That seems like a game changer for me. But in any case, New England seems more family friendly. If I'm gonna go somewhere, I'd like to go where I feel like there's been some kind of civilization established, towns and communities. There seems like more opportunity in New England, right? Because there's less social stratification. There's this sort of sense that everyone is more equal. So it's kind of hard to convince people in England to come to the Carolinas because they perceive, they perceive the Carolinas as being an extension of Virginia, right? They're further south. They're supposed to be focusing on agriculture, all this. So the people they finally attract are the second sons of planters in the Barbados. So I want to teach you a word here that maybe you're not as familiar with, and the word is primogeniture. And primogeniture means, well, it doesn't mean, it is an English law that says that all land in a family has to be passed on to the first son. So you might go, well, why is there a law about how you can pass on land? Well, here's why. Let's pretend that I am a rich lord in England. That sounds like a nice fantasy for me, Downton Abbey style. Anyway, so I've got, let's pretend, 1,000 acres. Okay, I'm pretty wealthy. That's pretty cool. Well, let's say I have only 2 sons, and because this is an easy math here for Mrs. Rodriguez, the history teacher, but you know they all have more than 2 sons, right? Or generally. Okay, but let's say I accept 2 sons. I might like to divide my land. I love both of my sons equally, so I'll give 500 acres to one guy and 500 to the other. But now, oh no, 500 acres is barely enough to be rich, y'all. This is rough. Worse, next generation, both of my sons have 2 sons of their own. Now each son only has 250 acres, and oh my gosh, they're only sort of rich. And then they have 2 sons. You get where I'm going with this? And so that over time, the land would be divided. You might go, why is it such a big thing? Like, if you want to do that, that's your land. You can do it, except for that in a society where, like, the entire structure of the English political system was based on rich people having power, it is frightening to think about the aristocracy losing power over time, like being gradually diluted because of land distribution. So the law actually said your holdings must be given to your first son. Second sons, sorry. You can hope that your elder brother dies of dysentery, or you can like join the army and try to make your way that way. And so in the Barbados, it says these are islands in the Caribbean. In the Barbados, there are many English people who have come and created plantations. They're growing mostly sugar cane. They're using imported African slave labor, and they are doing pretty well for themselves. They're very profitable. And so, but the second sons of these gentlemen in the Barbados, they don't have a lot of opportunity, but they do have a lot of experience. They know what it's like to run a plantation. They've grown up in the family business, and so it seems like kind of a nice idea. The Carolinas have a fairly similar, climate to the Barbados. We could go there and make make a name for ourselves, have our own land, and so they do. So the Carolinas are initially settled by imports immigrants from the Barbados, and with them they bring, and this is important, they bring not only plantations for agriculture, but we already had that in the Chesapeake. They also bring with them the fully developed system of chattel-based slavery. Let me write the word chattel for you. Chattel-based slavery. And you might sort of think this is not that big of a deal, because when I describe chattel-based slavery to you, you're going to say, well, isn't that what slavery is like? Well, kind of. Eventually, that's how it comes. But at this point, in about the 1650s, the slavery system that existed in the Chesapeake Bay was not what we would have called a chattel-based system. So what is chattel-based slavery? Well, chattel should remind you of the word cattle, and that's about how it works, right? So in a chattel-based slave system, then slaves are seen as literally the same as animals that I can own. So nobody can tell me what to or what not to do with my own animals, my dogs or my cows or whatever. I can buy and sell them. I can split up families of my animals, the litters of puppies or whatever it is. I can make my animals do anything I want them to do. I can kill my animals if I want to, when I want to. There are no ramifications, right? And you're all going, oh, and animals are always animals, right? Like, the offspring of my animals are never going to turn into non-animals. Like, that's how it goes. Well, that's also how chattel-based slavery works. Slaves are slaves forever. Their children will be slaves, and the owners can do with their slaves anything they want to. They can buy and sell them against their will. They can separate families if they want to, and they can do anything to a slave, physically punish or hurt, as well as up to and including killing slaves without any legal ramifications. And that really wasn't the case in Virginia where slavery existed at the time. We did have some slaves in North America prior to the arrival of the slaves from the Barbados, but slavery was not nearly such a fixed perspective. In some areas, the offspring of slaves were free. Like, the slaves' children would not be slaves. You know, they reached a certain age and they could be free on their own. In some areas, there were limitations, things that could not be done to slaves, right? So you can't sell your slave if they don't want to be sold, or well, you can sell your slave, but you can't kill your slave, or there are punishments for injuring a slave, or things like that. But when the settlers come from Barbados, we really see the importation of this idea or notion of purely race-based slavery and the permanency of slavery. And so what we think of as slavery in America really is a product of the arrival of these plantation owners from the Caribbean, where conditions for slavery were much, much harsher than we had seen anywhere in North America prior to this. So there's that. And then, of course, there's Georgia. And I want you to take notice of this date right here, 1732. Georgia isn't founded until much later than the other colonies, right? So Jamestown is settled in 1607, right? That's an important date for you to remember. There's not a lot of dates in English. 1607 is one of them. So Jamestown is founded in 1607. The Pilgrims land in 1620. The Puritans come in 1622. Those dates are less important. So we've got, more than a century has passed from the founding of the first British colonies to the founding of Georgia. And there's some reasons for that. First of all, Georgia occupies a part of the North American landscape where there are lots of pretty hostile Native Americans. So there's sort of this reluctance to sort of settle this area. Also, Georgia borders Spanish Florida. And although realistically the Spanish didn't pose that big of a threat by this time, there were still fears about the Spanish. The Spanish could try to mass their armies against us at any time. The Spanish could try to invade the British, whatever. And there was a lot of inter-imperial conflict, so I guess there was some legitimacy there. In any case, Georgia was a hard sell until in the 1730s, a guy named James Oglethorpe. Oglethorpe is kind of a fun word to write down. Oglethorpe, James Oglethorpe. And James Oglethorpe has this idea. He says, all throughout England, Oglethorpe, Ogletthorpe. So Oglethorpe says, there are all these people in England who are like languishing away in debtors' prisons, right? They haven't committed any crimes. They just can't pay their debts, and so they're thrown in these debtors' prisons. And he goes, wouldn't it be awesome if we could take them to the New World, and they might like it, because, I don't know, working in the hot sun seems maybe like it would be better than, starving to death in some cold, rat-infested prison. Maybe, I'm not 100% sure about that. And then they can make us a profit, right? We can put them to work. They can, till the land, and we can grow some crops and sell them and all that. So originally, Georgia is founded as a debtor's haven, right? So people who are in prison for debt, they can come to Georgia, and that's going to be a better place for them, so-called. As that goes so well, that then England decides that they're going to continue to use Georgia for kind of similar purposes, but now not just debtors, but actual criminals. So you might be sentenced for grand larceny or something, and you're going to be, at your trial, you're going to say, well, you could spend 10 years in prison, or you could go to America. I want you to pause for a moment and think about what that means for America, right? Are the colonies seen as this place of pride, this place everybody wants to go, this place that we value? I don't know, maybe not, right? If we think that a good choice is to send them the worst of society. I'm going to digress a little bit and give you a peek into the future. Sort of reinforcing the idea that the British don't super understand or respect the North American colonies, is that as time goes on, the king, he appoints governors for these royal colonies, right? So the colonies are governed. They have usually colonial assemblies, but then the governor will be appointed by the king. And generally, the kinds of people the king would appoint would be hey, you know how you're super inept and incapable of running the affairs of your tiny little county, but you think you are special and your dad did something cool for me, and so I think I need to honor you? How about you be a governor of Virginia? You know? And then we send these super corrupt or inept or people who like really only got their job because their daddy said so something to the king. They come to America and they do a horrible job, right? These are really bad leaders. We don't want them. And the colonies they feel this difference. They realize that they are not being sent the best and the brightest. That their leaders are bad leaders. And so, you know, if we're looking ahead to the revolution, which you should be, if we're looking ahead to, well, how do Americans get from these like super diverse colony groups to rebelling as one against the English crown? Well, this is part of the deal. There's a sense that like the British don't respect us. Kind of fun at the end. Anyway, so that's Georgia. So here's a little chart. You're not going to find a copy yet. I'm not going to leave that long. But I would encourage you can go online to our website and you can find this PowerPoint and you can print this chart because it's helpful for studying to kind of keep them all straight. The biggest idea is that we want to understand that each of these unique colonial subcultures contributed something important to the national identity of the United States, right? If it is the system of slavery or the idea of religious toleration or the growth of commerce or the development of of a representative form of government. Where was the first representative form of government in the United States? Or what would be the United States? In Virginia, and it was the House of Burgesses, right? So each area has things to contribute, and so we just want to kind of appreciate each of these. Okay, so we've already kind of done that. So I'm going to switch gears. Ooh, wrong one. I'm going to switch gears here now and fast forward about 50 years. And we're going to talk about 18th century, the 18th century British colonies. While we're there, I'd like to have a mini reminder about centuries and years. So, like here we go. So 1500 to 1599. 1600 to 1699, 1700 to 1799, 1800, and so on. What century is this? 1500 to 1599. It's the 16th century, right? Because if we went back to 0, the first century was 0 to 99, right? So the century, the number of the century is always 1 greater than the number of like the first 2 digits of the year. So the 17th century is what hundreds? Good. The 18th century then are the 1700s. So we are looking from the mid-17th to the early 18th century to right now. So that's kind of where we're focusing. So how do the British view the colonies? Well, to begin with, I want to take a look at this picture. And what do we see here? Do we know the name to describe what's going on here? You guys can recognize your shapes. Good job. So can Dorothy. Right now, excellent. This is the triangular train. What do we call just this part? This is the middle passage. What's this part? The Columbian Exchange, right? So just the exchange of goods between the old world and the new world, that's the Columbian Exchange. But the whole thing put together, this is the triangular trade, sometimes called the Atlantic system. Right, so all across the Atlantic we see trade going each way. And one thing we should notice is that every element of this trade, or of this cycle of trade, benefits whom? It benefits Europe, right? So the system is designed to benefit the Europeans, and that's because of something called mercantilism. That's because of something called mercantilism. So mercantilism is an economic theory that was widely accepted in the 17th and 18th centuries. And the idea behind mercantilism was that for a country to be wealthy, the number one biggest economic goal for a country should be to increase the value of gold in their treasury, right? The more money they've got in their treasury, the better and more powerful they are. Now, these days, economists disagree with that, right? Like, you don't have to have a lot of gold in your treasury to have a really strong economy. In fact, sometimes debt can encourage an economy to be stronger. Anyway, so we've moved away from this. But back then, the number one way to be a successful economic power is to increase the amount of gold in the treasury. And so the best way to do this, they're discovering, is to have colonies. Because here's the thing about colonies, they're captive markets, right? You own them. So you can make rules about what they can and cannot do, and they then become a captive market for your goods. So one of the best ways to increase the amount of gold in your treasury is to have what is known as a positive balance of trade. A positive balance of trade. And a positive balance of trade means that you export more than you import. I'm going to say that again. One of the ways to have more gold in your treasury is to have a positive balance of trade. That means that you export more than you import. Think about it this way. Exporting is when our country does what? It sells stuff to other countries. So if I sell more stuff than I buy, or greater value of stuff than I buy, what will my bank account balance look like? Positive or negative? Positive, right? If I sell a greater value of goods than the goods that I buy, what's the word for buying goods from other countries? Import, right? Import, buying goods from other countries. If I sell more than I buy, if I export more than I import, then in the long run, my country is gaining wealth. Now, does that make sense? So a big idea to make a positive balance of trade is to have a greater value of exports and imports. And having a colony means you have this group of people who have to buy stuff from you. So you can sell them a lot of stuff, and even better, they'll be willing, because you're going to make them, they'll be willing to sell you their raw materials at a favorable price. So they're going to sell me their raw materials for a low price. Then I can turn those raw materials into finished products for cheaper, and then I can sell them for the same price back to my colonies and make an even greater profit, right? So colonies are an important piece of mercantilism. When we have colonies, we are better able to maintain a what kind of balance of trade? A positive balance of trade, exactly. So that's the idea that's going along for the British. And so they began to, in about the 1650s, the Navigation Act of 1660, they began to pass a series of laws designed to squeeze the most out of the colonies as possible, to get the most value for their buck. You're going to notice a trend here. The most important one, the one that I suggest you know the most detail about, are the Navigation Acts. There's actually a whole series of the Navigation Acts. The first one was in 1660. They go all the way to the 1700s. But the Navigation Acts were like this. First of all ships that conduct trade in the British colonies in North America must be English ships. So we can't have any ships conducting trade in the colonies other than English ships. And they must have a 75% English crew. So we're not going to be enriching anybody who is not an English citizen. It gets worse. Certain goods, like tobacco, sugar, cotton, various dyes like indigo, ginger, molasses, rice, and so on, certain goods can only be sold to Great Britain. Certain goods can only be sold to Great Britain. Now hold on for a minute. What if I have a cupcake business? But by law, only Maya is allowed to buy from me. I am not allowed to sell to anybody but Maya. Maya, will you pay $5 for my cupcakes? No. How about $2? What would you like to pay for my cupcakes? Well, that's extreme. I love the one that's really bad. Maybe $1? Yeah. Whatever she says, I have to say yes, right? My options are $0. I make zero profit. I die. Or whatever the lowest amount she thinks she can get away with paying me, right? When we only have one person who's buying, it's called the monopsony. That's not important. That's an economics word. When we have only one person who's buying, then we're not going to get very good prices for our stuff. So there's that. And then, it gets worse. And then, anything the colonists want to buy has to pass through a British port first. So if I want to buy something from the Spanish, then the Spanish have to take it to England, sell it to the British traders are then going to bring it to the colonies, and they're going to, of course, mark it up, charge me a higher price, and then I could buy it from them. Any goods the colonists want to buy have to pass through an English port first, have to be bought from the English. Who do you think is most impacted by this? Yes, the colony. Which colonies do you think have the biggest problems? Maybe. I mean, they're going to grow indigo and rice, some, and tobacco, which would be affected by some of these laws. But is their primary focus of economic development, is it trade? New England is where it's the worst, right? Because the vast majority of the English economy, or the New England economy, is based on trade. Right? They don't grow, they don't get values in agriculture. They, build ships, and they were traders. Traders with a D, not traders with a D. Okay. Well, actually, almost. They're kind of both, right? Because eventually, where does the American Revolution begin? Are we surprised? You shouldn't be. Because of these policies. So if mercantilism is the prevailing idea guiding British policy, and if mercantilism has the most negative effects in New England, where they want to benefit from trade as well, you would imagine that in New England, there's going to be some antagonism growing for the king, right? So that's not surprising. Let me tell you what reality is, however, which is that nobody follows the navigation acts, or almost nobody follows them. Widespread smuggling means that there is very little impact in reality on the colony. A little bit of like grumbling here and there. But even the British inspectors who are in the colonies trying to make sure that the laws are followed, they just look the other way, right? There's no will in England to to step in and force the colonies to comply. There's no will to send a vast fleet of British warships to make sure no smugglers get there. There's just no will for that. And so people smuggle left and right, and nobody cares. Another example, the Wool Act, this one of 1699, forbids any wool from being sold in the colonies unless it is imported from England. So if you want wool, you got to buy it from England. And if you have wool, you can't sell it to anybody. You can't export it from the colonies. You might go, why do we care about wool? Well, because a large part of the English rural economy was based on growing or raising sheep for wool. And so the people in England were mad because although the colonists weren't supposed to ever have sheep, I'm not sure that was a thing, they weren't supposed to bring sheep with them on their ships. But they did. They smuggled their sheep in, and it turns out New England is a great place to raise sheep. And so there's actually a pretty large sheep industry going on, wool industry in New England, and it's hurting the British wool industry. And then they passed the Wool Act. You want to know what happens? We completely disregard it. Widespread smuggling. Widespread smuggling. Then there's the Molasses Act. This one in 1733. This one says that if you want to buy molasses, if you want to use that to produce, you're going to have to pay this tax on British molasses. Remember, going back to the Navigation Act, you have to buy molasses from the British. Well, it turns out that smuggling molasses from the Spanish or the French is much cheaper. And so by trying to force them to pay this tax, in New England, where many are producing rum with molasses and then selling it, it's one of their big products, that they have to now, their profits are suffering because of the Molasses Act. And you want to know what happens? We completely ignore it. More smuggling. Right, oh, look at it, it says smuggling out there. Completely disregard it. Now, at this point, what I want you to know is that although you should know some detail of the Navigation Act, more important than knowing all of this information, right? Copying those words is not helping them. More important than that, what is the big picture here? What idea are we trying to communicate right now? The British are trying to do what? Increase their profits. And in doing so, it would, if it was followed anyway, it would do what? It would restrict colonial trade, it would restrict colonial profits, right? The colonial economy would be stunted if they were forced to abide by all of these things. Now, you need to be able to use some examples. Naming and describing the Navigation Act is good, and you should have kind of in your brain, and I know there was some of the Wool Act, some of the Molasses Act too, and that's good enough. You don't need to know all the details about every single act. We're taking big picture here. What are the British trying to do, and can you name a few examples of times when they did that? So don't panic about trying to memorize the intricacies of these particular laws. Not important, okay? What is important is this big picture. But again, we just smuggle. We just do whatever we want to do. We just continue to trade basically without being hindered, and the British don't do much to stop us. This is called salutary neglect. This is called salutary neglect. What does it mean if someone is being neglected? They're being ignored, not cared for, not like disciplined, they're just being sort of left alone. And for a long time, this is kind of the British policy towards the American colonies. It's sort of like, look, we passed these laws, but really, so long as you don't make a lot of trouble, we're just like, whatever, you know? Just whatever. Except for that, I want you to take sort of a different view on this. What if, for 6 weeks in this classroom, I let you do whatever the gosh darn heck you wanted, right? Like, sleep, play games, talk, text on your phone, whatever you want to, work on other homework, just, I never say anything. I just kind of go, okay, whatever, I do my own thing. And I stand up here and I talk to you, but if you don't pay attention, I don't say anything about it, just whatever. And then on week 7, I walk in on Monday morning, I start screaming at you. You, put that away. No, I'm sending you to the office. You're going to detention. How dare you? Well, first of all, you might think I'm schizophrenic. And are you going to respect my authority? Even though we might agree that I have the power and the authority to tell you not to use your cell phones in my room, if I let you do it without saying a word for 6 weeks, and then all of a sudden I try to tell you not to, you would think that I was treating you unfairly, right? How dare she tell us we can't use it? We've always used our phones, and it's never been a problem before. We've gotten good grades in the test. Why is she trying to get involved now? You understand how that would feel? Well, the colonists experienced something very similar. Because for more than 100 years, the English government, they passed policies, but they didn't make any significant or strong effort to enforce them. They just sort of, what, here's the rule, if you follow it, cool, and if not, like, oh well. When that begins to change, in the beginning of the 18th century, the colonies, as you understand, felt very frustrated. How dare they all of a sudden expect us to follow all these rules? How dare, what are they thinking? We've been fine on our own, it's never been a problem before. Who do they think they are? And so a lot of, maybe we might agree, well, hopefully we don't agree with colonialism, but maybe we might understand that the British would have felt fully within their rights, right? This was their colony. The colonies weren't part of the original country. Like, the government can do, they support the colony, they sustain the colony, they have the authority and the right to tell the colonies what to do. But because they didn't do that from the beginning, because the British government wasn't involved from the very beginning in a strong way, trying to shift later on, 100 years later, to this is going to cause some problems, right? It's going to be a source of tension. Okay, so let's talk British politics. In 1684, King James II, who, if you know anything about British politics, and I know very little, but I know a tiny bit, if you know anything about British politics, you will remember that James II is not one of England's favorite kings. He was too Catholic, which we know is a sin worse than death. He's too Catholic, and the British, work really hard trying to get rid of him. But while he's in power, he decides that he wants to show England what a real king is like. And he's going to start in the colonies, because even as early as the 1680s, the New Englanders are already bucking against British authority. We talked about it, right? All the smuggling against the Navigation Acts. Additionally, the New Englanders had very strong colonial assemblies, town councils, and they didn't tend to care what the king said. So he wants to remedy all of that. And the way he's going to do it is by dissolving the colonial charters for all of these New England colonies. We would call them states. They were colonies. He wants to dissolve their charters and replace them with a new charter for the whole area. You can see here. Replace them with a new charter for the whole big swath that he's going to call the Dominion of New England. One big colony, get rid of all their colonial assemblies, and in charge of this colony he's going to put a governor named Sir Edmund Andros. I think I have his name. Here we go. Sir Edmund Andros. Sir Edmund Andros was one of those guys who everybody hated, right? He was kind of effeminate, and he was sort of cruel and calculating. He didn't didn't listen or respect the views of the colonists and their desires for self-government, that kind of thing. And so it's not surprising that just a few years later, when the Glorious Revolution occurs, right, they bring in William and Mary, and they create a new line of the British monarchy. When the Glorious Revolution occurs and the colonists hear about it, so James II has been overthrown, the colonists hear that James II is out, William and Mary are in, what do you think they do? They get rid of Andros really quick. Well, first they overthrow the sort of like the structure of the Dominion of New England, and then they hunt down Andros. He tries to escape by dressing like a woman, but he forgot to change his shoes, so his boots were still like manly. I don't know what manly boots look like in the 1600s, but whatever. He forgets to change his shoes, and he's spotted. And then they grab him and they run, whatever. So there's this big hostility. And what I hate to tell you, it's kind of like if Nate is in the grocery store, and he like throws this fit because he wants some cookies, and he starts screaming, "I want the cookies!" And if I say, "Okay, fine, here's your cookies," what is he going to do the next time that he wants something and I say no? He's going to scream, right? Well, okay, so the British government tried to impose authority. The colonists hated it. It actually isn't a cause and effect relationship because something separate happened in England which caused a new royal government to be instituted. But the effect was the colonists complained, and pretty soon they got what they wanted. He's gone. William and Mary agreed to sign off on like new old charters for each of the individual colonies, and the colonists learn a lesson, right? Protest, and you'll get what you want. Not necessarily a bad lesson to learn. We're Americans, after all. This is America Day. But you understand why that might be problematic, or at least why the British should have maybe thought twice about their choices there. Okay. So what happens then? Well, of course, the Dominion overturns. William and Mary are going to give that, and the colonists are going to feel like they have more of a say maybe than the British think that they ought to. But sort of getting away from politics, let's think about British culture or European culture more broadly. One thing that's important to understand is that by the middle of the 18th century, there are plenty of, well, we wouldn't call them thriving, but by the 18th century standards, thriving cities in America. New York City, for example, Boston, Philadelphia, Charlestown, and so these are urban environments. And many of them have the same kinds of art installations, fashion, like literature being passed around, all of those things as we would see back in England. So there really are pretty strong cultural ties between many of the things. Oh, I'm so sorry. We'll pick up here on Monday.